The subject of the third eye is one that I have given probably 500 or 600 times in many cities of North America, and more recently in 50 cities in the United Kingdom. Really and truly, the lecture is a textbook subject because it is salient to the matter of spiritual development. It's quite impossible to grasp the range of spiritual disciplines required of man on the path without some consideration of this extraordinary proposition of the third eye. And of course, this country in particular has a tremendous tradition involved in the subject of the third eye. We know that many of the nation's fathers were Rosicrucians. Some of them, of course, were Masons, and others of various esoteric orders. So we're not really surprised, understanding this, that there is the pyramid. The pyramid is taken as one of the central features of the United States crest. The spectacular part of the pyramid, of course, lies in the upper third of it, in which the all-seeing eye is to be located in this crest of the United States of America. And it always presents a challenge, I think, to the materialist attitudes of this nation, and also a comfort, I think, to the esoteric groups struggling for expression in this nation. This eye of inner vision, located in the upper third of the pyramid in the United States crest. Well, what were the fathers of the nation getting at? When you lay down structures for a nation, either its constitution or its political features, you're not doing this idly. It's a serious matter, and men were gathered together in a serious frame of mind and did not choose the concept of the organ of inner vision lightly. Now, we know from our most recent discoveries, due to sensitive instruments that we are now beginning to use in the world, we know that pyramidal shapes are accumulators of energy. Pyramidal shapes are accumulators of energy. And in fact, this is true of all symmetrical shapes. Shapes are accumulators of energy. They are like a car battery that can accumulate energy by virtue of the apposition of the plates of the battery lying together opposite each other in an acid medium. Shapes are accumulators of energy. Whether the shape is pyramidal, as I have just described, whether it is spheroid, or whether it is cuboid, the shape accumulates energy. And the quality of the energy varies according to the shape. The quality of the energy varies according to the shape. And the shape of the object need not be a stone pyramid. It can be a cardboard pyramid, but it will still accumulate energy. It needn't even be a cardboard pyramid. It can be a pyramid made of mental substance. And so those of us who practice meditation, who learn to stop the flow of thoughts, the incessant flow of thoughts, to slow them down, to space them out, and then halt them, we know that if we pose certain shapes through the process of visualization in the space between thoughts, we are creating accumulators of energy inside ourselves. And so we can create by visualization, which is not imagination, we can create by visualization appropriate shapes. Many of these shapes have been handed down to us traditionally. The lotus is the symbol of eternal life. It's the symbol of rebirth into eternal life. And so to visualize a lotus structure implied that qualities of an eternal nature are likely to flow in through the space between thoughts into the human aura. And then, of course, we understand that man himself, seated in certain positions, adopts appropriate shapes. And if he is seated in the Padmasana, it has been shown clearly that the Padmasana forms a pyramidal structure. The lotus position forms a pyramidal structure. But we also know from our discoveries recently highlighted that pyramids not only store energy, and certainly Charles Dickens used to keep his razor blades inside a pyramid structure. Not only do pyramids store energy, but the kind of energy in the pyramid varies. The energy in the upper third of the pyramid is different from the energy in the lower third of the pyramid. We do know that the energy about a third of the way up the pyramid is conducive to the preservation of mammalian tissue. And so you can preserve the body of a mammal in a pyramid at the first third of its height. There are energies there appropriate to the preservation of the mammalian structure. But the energies in the uppermost third of the pyramid are special. They are somehow related to spiritual unfoldment. They tease or titillate the energies of chakras in the upper third of man. And if man is seen in Padmasana, which is the most characteristic pose of yoga, if man is seen in Padmasana as a pyramid, then we are talking about the energies located in the upper third of the pyramid. And so the eye of inner vision, which lies here in the space between the eyebrows, is located in the seat of Padmasana, in the position of the upper third of a pyramid. Now, in our studies in Claregate College, we learn to recognize that all symmetrical structures have energy qualities, and that they are capable of storing these energies. We know, for instance, that the pyramidal structure is conducive to the storage of energies on the second ray of love wisdom. The second ray of love wisdom is pyramidal in its storage capacity. But this is the ray of the soul of the United States of America. And so the choice of the pyramidal structure was not an idle one as the crest for this nation. It is a pity that the architects of the nation have not been more aware of it. It has been left to the esoterically inclined architects to create pyramidal structures in this country. However, the Atlanteans knew about it. And the Atlantean colonies, which eventually far exceeded the motherland in their power and strength and cultural integrity, planted pyramid structures all around the borders of the old Poseidonis, about which I'll be talking on Sunday, tomorrow. And so the pyramid was recognized by the Atlanteans as being an important accumulative structure in which men could participate for their initiatory rites, and that inside this structure there would be a play of energy upon the person's own head chakras. And so the subject of the third eye tonight is concerned with an organ of inner vision, certainly, but it has immense ramifications. It goes into the structure that you live in, your home. Is it a spatial structure conducive to your own rays, the ray of your soul? Is it a structure conducive to the gentle opening of chakras above the diaphragm? What about the colors? And so on. We know that the spheroidal structure is related to the first ray of will and power. The first ray of will and power. And indeed the spheroid acts as a lens for accepting the energies of Atma, the energies of Atma. When I was a young man who had gone out into retirement in a virtual wasteland in the southern tip of Africa for 3 years, it was my great joy each morning to climb a great sand dune in the midst of this waste, and there to seat myself, as it happens in true Western style, my never being able to have achieved the Padmasana, in Western style, to seat myself a large, soft, easy chair at the top of the sand dune, facing the rising sun. So each morning I would watch, coming out of the Atlantic Ocean, in fact it was where the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean meet, I would watch this great red ball coming out of the sea. Great red ball coming out of the sea. It was years later that I realized that my rising sign was Libra rising, which is the equivalent of a ball coming out of the horizon of the sea. But the great red ball, orange red ball that I would see there in front of my eyes, I soon learned to put there in the space between my eyes so that I could see it when I was not looking at it. And I used to find that I was energized enormously by the capacity, the ability to put this orange-red orb there whenever I needed it. Not when I was just seated watching the sun come up, but in the middle of the night when I needed the energy, and later when I was doing my medical studies. And so by what one might say a hit-and-miss method, I had stumbled upon this ability to tap energy accumulators and shapes. Of course, we mustn't stop there. I, on my part, go ahead with my subject, and you on your part must go out into the world sometime and use what you've learnt here this weekend in the world. And you need to understand that there are other energy accumulators. The sonnet poem is an energy accumulator. And so we very quickly learn that shapes exist in terms of language, that shapes exist in terms of sound, that what sound we hear, the devas see, and therefore sound is basically a spatial concept. And certain sound patterns and mantras are energy accumulators, and when we sound them, they release their energy into the aura and are refilled immediately from the great storehouses of nature. If we cooperate with nature, nature will help us. Nature will pour her energies into us. We need, however, to understand that we are children of nature. We forget this frequently. We come bound by the social attitudes, as I heard Jackie say last night. We are bound by the Maya, the miasma, the illusion of culture. We are bound by concepts dictated to us by our churches, by our education boards, and so on. And we must be very careful of not falling into these gaps, these spaces on the path of discipleship, where we learn to discriminate the real from the unreal. And you must apply that discrimination to the world about you, to your culture, to your social ways. And one cannot just pick and choose. You either work with nature or you don't. So when you tread the path, many matters come up for consideration, and not the least of which is the matter of energy accumulation. The third structure that I should, of course, mention is the structure of the cuboid, and it would be better if I put it in a green coloring, for its ray is the third ray of active intelligence. And so cuboid structures like an emerald, which has a natural cuboid crystalline nature, these are third ray on the ray of active intelligence, and through an understanding of the ray psychology, you may then add 50 correlations to any of these shapes. the third ray of active intelligence, the planet Saturn, the sign of the zodiac, Capricorn, Libra, and Cancer. Then you could go to the appropriate chakra, which is the throat, and the appropriate sound, which is fa, when middle C is do, and so on and so on and so on. And so, through understanding basic energy patterns, you can learn what parts of the body are responsive to their qualities. And it is on this sort of basis that we can begin to look at the subject of the third eye, the subject of the third eye. For many of you, you were introduced to the subject by the strange book, The Third Eye, by Lobsang T. Rampa, not to be confused with my own book of the subject, which is a very different and a more Western or Occidental approach. The Third Eye by Lobsang Rampa came out about 1958, and it was a sensation. It was a book that was read by hundreds of thousands of people, and there was an immense amount of comment about the genuineness of the author. There was the school in England that was Tibetan and said that the book was genuine. There was another school equally strong that said the book was fraudulent. And so an immense amount of argument was raised over it. The book tells the story of a little Tibetan boy of high birth, who is taken to a monastery in Tibet, and in this lamasery he is subjected to stern discipline and training. And part of his unfoldment is to undergo an operation. And the operation is calculated to open his organ of inner vision. And so between the brows an operation is made, a hole is trephined through the skull, and a wooden sliver is inserted into the brain tissue through the hole bored into the boy's skull. 3 high lamas undertake the operation. They harden the sharpened stick with candle flame. They insert it through the hole of the boy's skull, and they leave it there. They leave it there for a period of about 8 or 9 days, and then in semi-darkness the boy is allowed to exercise his faculties and wait until the time comes when they remove this wooden sliver from his skull. The effect is, at least that's what we're told in the book, the effect is to give the boy clairvoyance, to exercise, to open up the visual faculty of this organ of inner vision. He comes out of his darkened room for the first time into the courtyard of the lamasery, and he is staggered to find that people are different. He sees on the first occasion the cook from the lamasery who's raging around the courtyard in an awful passion. He's upset about something, and the little boy gives a squeak of fear because the cook looks as if he's on fire. Great big bellowing waves of red fire and smoke are pouring from the cook, and the boy has seen the cook's aura for the first time, and it gives him something of a start. And so there is this story of the bringing up of this boy in the Tibetan monastery, and how he leaves it eventually and comes to the West. It was a very well-told story. The Tibetan authorities examined every detail of it closely, and many of them pronounced it to be absolutely valid and true. And so in this sort of climate or atmosphere, an exposure was made of the author. It turns out that a private detective had been placed upon his tail, and the author turns out to be an English plumber, Cyril Hoskins. And Cyril Hoskins, without ever having been to Tibet, is able to write this extraordinary book. accurate in almost every detail about intimate esoteric ways of life in Tibet. The story doesn't end there, of course. An investigation into the life of Cyril Hoskins shows that he is married to a state-registered nurse, that the nurse had been observing changes in her husband's personality for the last few years. She noticed that he became completely changed in his attitudes. He began to speak a foreign language, and then began to write down the story of the third eye in a personality very different from what he once possessed. When the book was completed, the personality that was previously there began to resume its former shape, as it were. And so something had happened during the writing of the book. That was her story. Today, speaking something like 30 years later, or 20 years later, I can tell you that I was in correspondence with Lobsang Rampa at the time, and I did some investigations into the matter of the book. The book is valid. The book is written by a Tibetan Lama. There's no argument about it. The Tibetan Lama overlorded is the word that I prefer to use, overlorded the body of the ailing English plumber, Cyril Hoskins, who was undergoing a nervous breakdown, or schizophrenic experience, if you wish. He occupied the body, wrote the contents of the book, and then slowly, gently removed himself, returning the plumber to full health. So that is the background to the book on the third eye, and it in no way, of course, clashes with what I have to say here tonight. And I'm concerned with an analysis from a Westerner's point of view of the third eye. Of course, the third eye is very old. Going back into Egypt, it is the eye of Horus. It is the eye of Horus in Egyptian mythology. The Egyptian hierophants themselves had to be of royal birth before they were allowed to use the symbol, of the third eye, which was the seated cobra. The seated cobra on the heads of the Egyptian hierophants or initiate priests. The seated cobra is the symbol of the third eye. In my later talks this weekend, I'll be showing how this concept of a seated serpent indicates the presence of higher energies which can be channeled in a sharp, split, outward-going manner. Some of us call it a flash of intuition. A flash of intuition. Certainly the Egyptian hierophants saw the third eye often manifesting as something that struck outwards into the world, and with absolute certainty and surety of a cobra posed to strike its victim. In Roman and Greek mysteries, of course, we have the third eye depicted as the winged rod. The winged rod representing, if you like, as I have described it in our textbook, The Jewel and the Lotus, either as the wings of some divine angelic being centered around a rod which has a point of swelling at the top, and this rod may be the symbol of consciousness leaving the body whenever the body is balanced between its opposites, which we call the entwined snake. Also, some will say, well, the two wings are the lowered eyelids, one eyelid, other eyelid, and between the two, the sacred point or square inch between the brows. So, if you really want to go into a study of the various symbols of classical mysticism, you can soon pick up the story of the third eye in symbolic form. If we shift to the New Testament, this rod, of course, was carried by, as the caduceus, by Hermes, or the Roman name of Mercury, the same god. In the New Testament, when we shift our attention to it, this is the organ of inner vision which Paul refers to when he says, "If thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be filled with light." There's only one way that you can make the eyes single, and that is to concentrate them into a common point. And if the eyes are turned inwards and upwards so that that point lies within the body, then the point comes again to the space between the eyebrows. If thine eye be single. In English mysticism, of course, we have the great symbol of the horn of the unicorn. The unicorn itself, and I'm very poor at drawing horses, but if we take the unicorn itself as being a rampant horse, a white, fabulous creature, then the answer is that the horn of the unicorn in its classical position, is a median horn coming from the position we've just described, and a horn that spirals to a point. The spiral is always the symbol of focus. Spiral is always the symbol of focus. Incidentally, if it interests you, then perhaps I should mention that which pertains to many of our acts of discipleship, and that is that you wish to release the energy of a reservoir that you have created in mental substance between the brows. If you wish to release the energy into your aura, obviously, then you use this, the symbol of focus, or if you like, coming to the central and most important point of the image. And immediately you do this, you're focused on it, the energy is released into you, and as fast as it's released into you, the energy pours into the visualized object from the inner world. And that then is the symbol of focus. No matter what object you focus on in meditation, if you find the pregnant point of it, pregnant is a word I choose carefully, the point that's going to give birth, then that's the point that you would focus on here in the upper third, indicated by the eye of inner vision. And so whether we look into English mysticism at the Christian level, in which the aura is seen as a shining bowl, the aura is a shining bowl, or the holy grail of Arthurian legends, which is constantly filled with energy, no matter how you look at this matter of the third eye, the great cultures of ancient days mentioned it, spoke about it, depicted it. Now we have to examine the matter from the point of view of evidence for the existence of this third eye, the evidence for it. Well, we can trace evidence at certain different levels. The one that I must choose here now is the physical basis for the third eye. For that's the first thing that you are asked, I'm asked on lecture tour. What is the physical basis of the third eye? Is there one? The answer is this, that if we go to the teachings of Madame Blavatsky, she spent quite a lot of space and time in her book, The Secret Doctrine, devoting that space and time to the matter of the pineal gland. The pineal gland was said by her to be the outer symbol of the third eye, the outer symbol of the third eye. Now, the pineal gland is an endocrine gland. It's an endocrine gland. And I think we should clear this matter up straight away for the benefit of those who come to the next talk. The difference between an ordinary organ and an endocrine organ. An ordinary organ is a group of cells of a common nature which are bound together to make an organ, and these cells secrete a material into a tube or a duct, and the duct comes out of the gland and its secretions pass into a body cavity, and we call that an ordinary gland. It can be the salivary gland, which lies in the cheek just in front of the ear, the parotid gland, which passes its saliva along a duct into the mouth above the third premolar tooth, squirts it into the mouth. That's a typical gland. But when we talk about an endocrine gland, we mean something different. And an endocrine gland does not have a tube. In fact, the endocrine gland is tubeless or ductless. It has no duct. So many people call the endocrine gland ductless gland. The endocrine gland secretes its material straight into the blood. Secretes its material straight into the blood. And so the hormone, which is what the endocrine gland always secretes, is passed into the blood directly and circulates around the body in the blood system. Now that's an endocrine gland, and all of you of course should know that. And so we are talking about an endocrine gland of that sort called the pineal gland. Pineal because it is shaped something like a pine cone and was examined by the ancients and seemed to be like a pine cone in shape. It is tiny, about as big as a pea, and it has a certain position in the brain. In the Greek mysteries, the child Bacchus plays with a pine cone and with a hand mirror. The hand mirror is the symbol of the inner worlds. When you look at a mirror, you see your image in an inner world, somewhere that has no place in time and space. It's in the mirror. The pine cone represented the pineal gland. The arousal of the pineal gland gives the individual an opportunity to see into the inner worlds, and that's the symbol of the hand mirror. The ability to take it up and look into the inner worlds when you want to, hence the hand mirror. It isn't there all the time, thank God. Just imagine seeing the inner worlds all the time when you're trying to drive a car in the middle of a traffic jam or something like that. Nature has been very kind to us. Some of us think too kind. We would secretly like to look into these inner worlds. Well, you wouldn't like to have it around you all day long, I can assure you. So the pineal gland is the physical part of the third eye. We must examine it. The pineal gland lies between what we call the forebrain, which is a mass of ganglionic tissue making up in man the region of consciousness. It's the foremost part of the brain, and the hindbrain is a region of swelling of the same tube, which is responsible for matters which are not in consciousness. Balancing that we do without doing it consciousness. Coordination of limbs, and so on. Forebrain, hindbrain. And then we have between the two, we have the so-called midbrain. The midbrain linking the two together. Then we have the stem of the brain, and then finally the spinal cord. There it is. The forebrain, the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the spinal cord. That's easy enough. Well, the pineal gland lies between the forebrain and the hindbrain. The pineal gland lies between the forebrain and the hindbrain. It is part of a hollow in the brain and spinal cord which contains cerebrospinal fluid. And so the pineal gland is really an evagination. It is a little inlet or lay-by, if I could use such a word, of the canal which contains the spinal fluid. There's the spinal fluid. Now, when we look at some primitive animals, we find that some of them, with their tiny forebrain, have got an enormous pineal gland and a tiny hindbrain and spinal cord. And we're thinking now of the Tuatara lizard of New Zealand. We're thinking of the hagfish and some other creatures. And we find that in these individual animals, their skulls become thinned over the pineal gland, and except for a couple of layers of cells, the pineal gland is hardly covered by skull at all. In fact, the pineal gland has got in its substance cells which are very like the cells at the back of a human eye. They are pigmented cells, and it seems as if these particular primitive creatures still have got a functioning third eye. That they have their two ordinary eyes, which they use, there's one and there's the other, but they have a third eye still functioning, which is their pineal gland. And so far from it being something ridiculous, there is a physical basis for believing that at one time or the other, somehow in man's dim distant past, that his pineal gland may have been much larger or longer, and that, seeing that it still contains pigmented cells, possibly at a very early stage of human development, it functioned. Sometimes, rarely, the posterior fontanelle doesn't close, and we're left with an opening there, bearing testimony to the fact that it is possible that the skull was open there in ancient days, and that the pineal gland, probably greatly modified, lay in this region. Well, now, when we examine the testimony of Madame Blavatsky in her Secret Doctrine, which is confirmed later by C.W. Leadbeater and Annie Besant, and then confirmed another generation later by Alice Bailey, we find that the esoteric evidence is that man's skull was very differently shaped in early days. The first true men on the planet had a forebrain shaped something like that, and the midbrain had this pineal gland on the end of a long stalk like that, with a hindbrain shaped something like that. Man's skull was over this, and his face, of course, down here, and the shape of the skull was what we call acrocephalic. Man was acrocephalic. He had a long, elongated skull. And it is through this opening of the posterior fontanelle that the pineal gland was able to act as an organ of vision. C.W. Leadbeater modified that somewhat and said that in his clairvoyant perception of conditions on the planet about 15 million years ago, the pineal gland was being used as a heat sensation organ, an organ of perception of heat, because at that time the planet was overcast with immense volcanic smoke and fumes, and everywhere there were volcanic craters, and the biggest hazard to man was that he would fall into the fissures in the ground which were full of volcanic lava, and the pineal gland acted in that capacity. Blavatsky says that with the passage of time an immense change occurred in the anatomy of primitive man. She said in the early days man's eyes were closed. Man's eyes were closed. That in the region of what we now call the eye area, the lids were closed, and this area was filled with pigment. Much like a kitten's eyes are closed before or just after it's born, man's eyes were still developing, and they were closed, and the severe blue pigmented area here acted as a vague, sensitive area to light. Now, she asserted that as man became more familiar with the planet, his true eyes began to develop rapidly. They opened up, and the orbits as we know them today became functional. When we look at the Darwinian theory with regard to the origin of species, with regard to natural selection and the way in which our own organs unfolded on the earth, we find that it is contradicted several times, but particularly by the development of the human eyes. There is no way that you can describe the development of the human eyes under Darwinian ideas. No way at all. If you study the embryology of the human eye, you will find that there is no way that you can suggest that functioning in the outside world is that it was useful for it to be, for instance, without a lens to start with. or for it to be blind to start with, in the sense that the eyelids were shut. And so this is a contradiction to the Darwinian theory. It was Madame Blavatsky's proposition that as the human eyes began to develop, began to focus, became stereoscopic, began to be very efficient in the world, as that went on, the third eye, or the pineal gland, began to recede. And the more that man used his two eyes, the less he used his pineal gland as an organ of vision. According to her, man was able to look into the inner worlds with his pineal gland. It was sensitive to light at depth, as it still is today. Still is today. It was sensitive to light and depth. Man had not yet materialized in the physical world. He was moving mainly in an etheric globe, which we call the Anima-Mundi of the planet, and which Blavatsky and Besson called the great Hyperborean continent. The Hyperborean continent was that region of the Earth's etheric body, which is in the North Pole. Blavatsky and Besson said it came down as far as Siberia, the lower borders of Siberia. And this, in the etheric world, was the region that man inhabited with plant life and with animal life in their etheric content. Many call it the Garden of Eden, out of which man fell. And the only way he fell out of the Garden of Eden or from the Hyperborean continent was that he fell into physical form. His etheric outline began to materialize a physical body. And until you have seen the phenomenon of materialization, you will never grasp what he has to say. Then you should seek out the seance room. And for that reason probably only. However, we are concerned with the matter of the third eye. However, having said all this, we must assert here now that the pineal gland is not man's third eye. It points to the third eye, but it is not the third eye. You know, when I went to medical school, only 18 years ago, when I went to medical school, we were told that the pineal gland was an organ that had atrophied, it had no known function, it was insignificant, and we should discard it, apart from the fact that occasionally it will produce a tumor growing on it, the tumor will invade it, so that you can have a pinealoma, cancer of the pineal gland. It's not worth worrying about. Don't study it. However, Bailey was already saying, and if I may correct my dear friend Rose Tomato, as early as 1922, when she published a treatise, or rather her earliest work, she was already saying that the pineal gland had many functions. It functioned as an endocrine organ. It was the University of Minnesota, only 10 years ago, who went in very carefully to the subject of the pineal gland and found that it has got functions. And these functions are damn significant, not only in everyday life, but to the esoteric teachings. The pineal gland, according to current scientific discovery, does this. It is responsible, firstly, for sexual maturation. Now, the whole history of man's development is one that parallels his sexual development. How he was originally asexual and reproduced by budding. Thereafter, he was bisexual, hermaphrodite, and finally split into two sexes, and has ever since searched for the lost part of himself. Which is the basis of Jungian psychology, the search for man's lost part. And so we have anima and animus presenting themselves in our dreams. For the male, it is the female figure seated on the edge of the ocean of the unconsciousness. Or for the male, it is the animus, and so on. And so, according to science, we find that the pineal gland, as Madame Blavatsky said, had a tremendous effect as it became endocrine and not sensory, on the sexual development of man, and still does to this day individually. Sexual maturation. In fact, if a boy has got a pinealoma with cancer of the pineal gland, he is mature sexually at the age of 6. He has the organs of a male adult at the age of 6. And so man has the capacity to change himself morphologically, tremendously so. Morphologically, he can change his shape merely through glands, never mind the esoteric counterpart. And of course the story of man's origin, the anthropogeny, the book that I have written on the subject, Anthropogeny, is full of man's changing of shape, his pleomorphism. And we have always said in the esoteric sciences, man possesses the instruments and mechanisms for changing his shape. He is constantly changing his shape. Man, in fact, today is slowly dematerializing. He is dematerializing because the planet is dematerializing. And if you don't believe that, then study the current scientific records about the registration of gravity. Gravity is getting less on the planet. And it has been the esoteric proposition for a long, long time that the whole of the planet and everything in it is getting subtler and subtler and subtler. We have been through the densest point of concretion, and we are on the ascending arc, and we are slowly dematerializing. The second thing that they discovered at Minnesota University was that this organ affects the body clocks. It affects the body clocks. The body systems are finely set up. They are triggered into operation by fine mechanisms. And these fine mechanisms which govern the activity of our body systems are geared to our planet's diurnal experience of day and night. Day and night rhythms affect the body clock. We call this circadian rhythm. Circadian rhythm. And when we fly across the Atlantic, when we extend our day to 16 hours, mine was 22 the day before yesterday, when we extend our days to 22 hours, we upset the body mechanism. We suffer from jet lag. And I'm engaged at the moment in trying to discover esoteric techniques for offsetting jet lag. And so the pineal gland, which sets the body's clock, is upset. And we suffer from circadian rhythm upset or jet lag. But it has been the contention of esotericists again and again that the pineal gland area is the target of meditation, and that if we observe life's rhythms cyclically and are very careful to be cyclic in everything we do, meditating at a certain time, recording our spiritual diaries at a certain time, when we are cyclic, we work in conjunction with soul forces. And so this ancient teaching is corroborated by the discoveries of Minnesota University that this is an organ in an area which is related to cycles in man's experience. There is also the observation that this region affects the retention of salt in the body, affecting the salt retention through the kidney mechanism. But we have always said, and Bailey said it, and before her Blavatsky, always said, when you are meditating for a whole weekend, if you decide to go into retreat, if you decide to withdraw from the world for a long period, then you should cut out salt. You should cut out salt. Because man tends to accumulate, to retain salt when he is in a subjective state, in a meditative state. And so you stop taking salt in because you stop excreting it when you're in a meditative state. So there are three things which corroborate what the esoteric sciences have been teaching for hundreds and thousands of years, corroborated by science recently. Is it any wonder that I say that these sciences need to be heard in the world? We're going to have a break now, and I'm going to take up the subject of the physical basis of spiritual development in 10 minutes. For the proposition that there is a third eye. But I must point out that this is only the physical approach, and I've stated several times that the pineal gland is not the third eye. But it does point to what the third eye is, and therefore we have to leave the physical plane a moment. We have to consider the more ethereal parts of man. The more ethereal parts of man. So many of you are aware now of the drawing that I'm going to put up here, that it must have already crept into your unconscious. I certainly hope that you are beginning to experience aspects of it in your meditation. Our proposition is quite clear. Man is not just a physical body. The structures that I have been describing so far have been physical structures. We have been talking about a pineal gland placed between the forebrain and the midbrain. Now we have to shift our attention to the subtle part of man. We must take into account this etheric body of man made out of materials which are still physical, but which are yet subtler than gas, liquid, and solid. The grossest of these is the ionic condition or state, and the subtlest of these is the equivalent of the electron. Man has an electromagnetic force field that acts as a body interpenetrating his physical sheath. That is the proposition. What is more, this etheric body he shares with all other men, because it is part of an etheric globe that we live in. The physical world, that's part of it there. There's North America, there's South America. The physical world is interpenetrated by an etheric sheath. It is called the Anima-Mundi. The Anima-Mundi. And every plant, every man, every animal has an etheric body. The etheric body is a body of vitality. Man does not live by bread alone. He does not live by metabolic energy elaborated in his liver and in the cells. Not that alone. He is energized by the energy of prana. So immediately we have to take into account this fact that the prana in the sunlit atmosphere of the earth is absorbed by breathing into this etheric body, and it is a channel to these etheric parts by specific tracts. The tracts described in ancient Hindu terminology as Ida, Sushumna, and Pingala, but we easily recognize the device of the caduceus of Hermes in these three tracts. Now this etheric body contains reservoirs of energy, and these reservoirs are called chakras. They are each of them radiant suns. And so if we're looking at a center here lying in the throat of man, so that you can almost pinpoint it by placing a finger on the upper part of the sternum manubrium, that is this little notch here, this groove at the top of the neck. In that notch, there it is, in that notch, or just above it, is seated the throat lotus. A lotus is a chakram, or a force field that is radiant. It radiates its energies outwards. It is fed by prana and other subtle forces, channeled to it by these major nadis, as it were. Now these chakras supply the overlying organs with energy. In the case of the throat, it is the human larynx, it is the surface of the lungs, it is the buccopharynx and other throat structures. They are energized by their appropriate chakra. And so the whole of man's organs are energized by related chakras. This is the etheric body of man. It is not particularly relevant today, but we should not exclude from our understanding that man has also got an astral body made of emotional substance interpenetrating this physico-etheric, and that the astral body has also got its chakras, which underlie those of the etheric body. Now, once you can understand that, then the matter of the third eye becomes simple. The understanding of it becomes quite simple. We have to understand then that in earliest man he was beginning to elaborate his chakras. Earliest man was beginning to elaborate his chakras. And by that we mean mainly centers below the diaphragm, is the earliest man, and these centers were related to his spiritual progress. Let us look at this more carefully now. The proposition here is this, that man, as he unfolded on the earth, began to open centers, beginning with a four-petaled lotus at the base of the spine, working through a six-petaled sacral center, a solar plexus chakram, a spleen chakram, a heart chakram, a throat chakram, and three head centers that we're going to consider in a moment. Spiritual development means change of energy pattern. Spiritual development means changes in your energy structure. Spiritual development means a shift of orientation of energy to higher and higher and higher centers. The first men on the planet were orientated in the race of Lemuria to this center here, the sacral center. We'll hear more about that chakra during the weekend. It was this center that was peculiarly suited to be opened by the experiences on the great continent of Mu, which extended across the massive Pacific Ocean. And in the great continent of Mu, the third root race was born. It was born out of its fall from the Hyperborean continent that I described earlier. And so the first men began to elaborate the sacral center. The development of the sacral center was paralleled by the growth of organs of sexual reproduction. Those organs could never have separated and become quite distinct into sexes without the growth of the sacral center. That was the great task of the Lemurian civilization, that man should be able at will to reproduce himself. Then there came Atlantis. A few million years later, Atlantis developed, and it provided an opportunity for man to develop the next chakra in his experience, which was the solar plexus center, about 2 inches above the navel, the solar plexus chakra. Here he learnt to draw energy from his astral body. From the astral body, he drew energy into his aura through the solar plexus chakra. The result of this was artistic creation. His music developed, his sense of color, his ability to create art was an expression of Atlantis. And so man unfolded the solar plexus center. The present root race is concerned with the opening of this center, the throat chakra, the 16-petaled lotus. And the masses of mankind are focused in an orientation of energy between these two centers. But what about the third eye? The ultimate destiny of man is to take all the centers' energies that lie below the diaphragm. The diaphragm is the floor of the breathing cage, that which we call the chest. The diaphragm is an important muscular structure esoterically. It marks the difference between lower centers and higher centers. Spiritual development is the opening of higher centers. So the diaphragm is an important demarcation area. Now, the future of mankind lies, obviously, in becoming Buddhas and Christs. or if you like, avatars, and beyond them, those which we call Namanikayas, Buddhas and Christs, individuals of high spiritual caliber, individuals who have begun to open the three head centers. The three head centers. Tantra Yoga is a science which teaches us to direct energies willfully, not leaving it to reincarnation, not leaving it to endless rebirth on the earth, but to direct energies consciously in what we call the disciplines of discipleship, from their lowest region to their appropriate higher one. Each chakra has an appropriate higher center. We call it the alter ego. The alter ego. So the sacral center's energies are directed to the throat. The solar plexus chakra's energies are directed to the heart. The chakra at the base of the spine has its energies directed to the thousand-petaled lotus. A man who has achieved on the earth, who no longer undergoes rebirth, does not come back into incarnation again, is an individual who has centered his energies in the head region. He produces there a halo of such luminescence that it can be observed by those around him, in a Christ or a Buddha. And so we are now in a position to understand what the third eye is, because man anchors his soul to himself, and there is the symbol of his soul, the immortal part of himself. He anchors the higher triad to his personality, which is a lower triad. He anchors it in the region of the head centers. He anchors it in the region of the head centers. And the three anchorage points of the soul are the three sites in the head region where his head centers are going to open. These are called the jewel and the lotus. These are called the jewel and the lotus. Three tiny pinpoints of fire which make a man different from an animal, which gives a man an opportunity for unlimited development of his consciousness and spirituality as distinct from an animal. On earth, animals had evolved under the Darwinian concept. The highest creature which the earth had managed to produce on its own, uninfluenced practically by divine archetypes, was the anthropoid, a gorilla-like structure, an orang, which existed on the planet about 25 million years ago. And a large number of these anthropoid species had developed to a certain level of consciousness, and they were hemmed in by a skeleton that could not be developed any further. The massive orang brain, large for animals on the earth, but tiny compared to humankind, was contained within a thick skull. A huge crest of bone anchored that brain within a skull that could not expand. This was the highest form of life produced by the earth under its own impetus. Meanwhile, there was materializing from the mental world into the astral, taking on an astral body, and then from the astral world into the etheric world or Hyperborean continent, there was slowly materializing divine man. Man with his origins in many parts of the solar system and even more of them in the universe. He slowly materialized an etheric body, and about 25 million years ago there met on the surface of the planet that structure of man which was divine, one stream of evolution, and that other structure of man, or the semblance of man, which was anthropoid and could go no further. It had reached the limit of its evolutionary development. Animal man and divine man. And the two were brought together in a massive operation which enabled one or two of the species of animal man to break out of the cul-de-sac that they had reached in their evolution. These one or two species, and the world is littered with fossils of the anthropoids that could not break out, one or two of these species were suitable for blending. The blending of brute and buddhi, as we call it. It was possible for their very primitive etheric bodies, with a very, very flimsy emotional sheath, to blend with the higher evolution, the divine man, in a process that I have described in our anatomy books as overlording. And so many divine species of man which had had life on the moon, which had had life on the Mars system, and even on the Venusian system, were presented on the earth for this massive operation in which the two streams of evolution were to be blended. The overlording divine type with the earthbound type. And there was a great period of difficulty and instability. Many of the overlording types refused to blend with the horrifying animal forms presented to them. Eventually, however, some types managed to overlord. They blended together, and there came the possibility of a breakout by the merging of these two great streams of evolution. And so we are taking now an image of a blending of the two. We are taking an individual that had reached an etheric stage of materialization, an etheric stage that began to blend with the etheric form of the anthropoid type. Many of them did not need this. Many of them were able to materialize on the earth in physical bodies without using the anthropoid evolution. But the general pattern was overloading. And it was then possible for the ape-like structure, flooded with the etheric form of the divine type, to undergo what we call individualization. A tremendous force derived from the Sirius system was channeled through the logos of the planet, and through him was applied to these divine etheric forms, and individualization brought the blending of the two streams together. And so the merging of the two evolutions produced animal man that had a divine origin. Animal man that had a divine origin. These rare types soon reproduced, and the process went on, so that the continuous overloading was now in the children of those that emerged from the blending. And all the time the process became less harsh. The earliest men, therefore, on the planet, the earliest men had 3 points of fire. 3 points of fire in the region of their heads, which were not awakened. They had other points of fire that were not awakened. The future throat center, the future heart center, and the future solar plexus center. These points of fire remained just that. They had brought with them, of course, many forces from the Hyperborean continent, and when these forces were brought into the blended form, the Hyperborean or etheric effects began to act upon the pineal region. The pineal region regressed, and we had the development of man as we more or less know him today. What then was the third eye? The third eye was a region of immense etheric sensitivity around the pineal gland. It was not a chakra. It was not a chakra. It was in a region of immense etheric sensitivity. which man had used to see with when he was an etheric being in the Hyperborean continent. But he brought it in and blended it with the animal part of him. The future of man is that this region is to open. So we come to our present day, in which we practice deliberately disciplines which take energies upwards, 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 through what I have described as Tantra Yoga. And so we can say today that energies are fast entering this head region. From the heart chakra, for instance, energies which have reached it from the solar plexus are now pouring into the region of the brow, the Ajna center as it is described in yoga. Similarly, energies that have been brought up from the sacral area, from here to the throat, are now being transferred to the outer major region. The outer major region, a point or a whirling disk of fire that lies on an axle between the angles of the jawbone, rotating this way, the outer major chakra. Similarly, from the base of the spine, there is emerging an energy that passes up to its alter ego, which is the head chakra. And these three centers have become the target of attention for disciples today. The fifth root race has within it certain emerging types whose energies are being opened in the brow region. When they have opened the heart first and the brow region follows, then this is a fine type of individual. When the brow center is opened up without the heart center being opened first, then you have the hard, callous, indifferent, materialist type that the world knows so well. The third eye, then, is somehow related to the opening of three head centers in a spiritual type of person. Now, when we practice spiritual disciplines, we set out deliberately to involve ourselves in certain activities which bring all three chakras into continual opening simultaneously. Occasionally, one center is opened abnormally. When the individual takes psychedelic drugs, when he uses alcohol for his own sensory enjoyment and becomes addicted to it, then one center may open abnormally, whilst the others remain retarded. And so we have psychic perception into the astral world, or what is known as delirium tremens. So we teach methods whereby the individual concurrently opens three centers together. This is the safe way, and the certain way in this respect is meditation. And from meditation there is derived, of course, the Cleargate method. With the opening of these three head centers concurrently, there is an overlapping of them. They overlap each other. And where they do overlap, there is an interplay. And in this triangular interplay, we have the apex of the pyramid. In this triangular interplay, we have the apex of the pyramid, which is where the lecture began. And all lectures should end where they began, with the title. Too often they don't end with the title. They end in some nebulous backwater. And so where the three head centers begin to overlap, there emerges the third eye. The third eye, therefore, is not the pineal gland, but it is related to the endocrine gland expressed through by the head chakra. The third eye is not the pituitary gland, though the pituitary gland is the endocrine gland that is expressed through by the ultimate center. The third eye is not the carotid body, but the carotid body is the endocrine gland that the ultimajor center expresses itself through. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the third eye.